Hi, thank you for joining us for the first in our series of virtual meetings, Enhancements to the Milwaukee River Greenway. My name is Natalie Dutak, and I'm Milwaukee County Parks Area of Concern Program Supervisor. The goal of the Enhancements to the Milwaukee River Greenway project is to restore environmental conditions in the Greenway so that they support healthy, self-sustaining communities of native fish and wildlife. This is a multi-partner effort. Milwaukee County Parks is working with Urban Ecology Center, River Revitalization Foundation, and the Village of Shorewood, all in coordination with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. Today I'll be discussing our Phase 1 deliverable, which are habitat management recommendations for the corridor. Before I get into the details of this project, I wanted to go over some key terms and background. You'll be hearing the terms habitat, natural communities, and habitat restoration quite a bit during this presentation. Habitat is a place that plants, fish, and wildlife call home. It's what we're looking to improve to help our fish and wildlife. A natural community, then, is a group of plants, fish, and wildlife that all live in one location. In our plan, we talk about some unique natural communities that are located within the Greenway. These natural communities made it the ideal candidate for restoration. When we're talking about habitat restoration in the area of concern, we're discussing repairing the damage that has happened to those communities over time in order to improve conditions for fish and wildlife. There are two primary issues that we are trying to address in our restored habitat projects. They're related to fish and wildlife habitat and fish and wildlife populations. As noted earlier, our region has suffered environmental degradation. While there are many issues that we could discuss, one primary contributing factor for habitat has been heavy development, which leads to habitat loss and then disconnected natural communities. In this case, we're talking about communities that are so fragmented that fish and wildlife species have difficulty reaching the habitat that they need to survive or having habitat of an adequate size to sustain them. This in turn leads to the reduced ability to sustain healthy populations. For our fish and wildlife populations, a lack of access to habitat directly impacts success and health of those species. What we're seeing now is low diversity of species and a lower abundance of the types of species that we used to see within the area of concern. While the actual list is much longer, I'm sharing some examples of the species we are trying to help in the area of concern. These include fish, like lake sturgeon and northern pike, amphibians including the northern leopard frog and blue-spotted salamander, mammals like the river otter and American mink, and a large variety of birds including the least flycatcher and black-crowned night heron. And finally, we also work to improve habitat for pollinators like the endangered rusty patch bumblebee. So what is the Milwaukee River Greenway and how does it fit into the area of concern? The Milwaukee River Greenway is a 7-mile river corridor that contains approximately 628 acres of parkland. It runs from the former North Avenue Dam to Silver Spring Drive. The Greenway contains 12 parks and more than 28 miles of recreational trails. But it is also home to communities of plants, animals, and natural features that have become rare throughout the county. This has made it the focus of partner restoration and protection efforts for decades. For this very same reason, it was selected as a priority area of concern project. The Greenway is part of an ecologically significant environmental corridor. It provides opportunities to restore regionally impacted natural communities, therefore improving conditions for a variety of fish and wildlife and helping meet area of concern goals. So on to the enhancements to the Milwaukee River Greenway project. Next question is, how will we restore habitat? First, the project area was narrowed down into 7 parks within the Greenway. These include Lincoln, Kern, Pleasant Valley, and Gordon parks, as well as the Milwaukee River Parkway Section 5, which is currently managed by the River Revitalization Foundation, Riverside Park, managed by Urban Ecology Center, and Hubbard Park, managed by the Village of Shorewood. These are sites that had the highest restoration potential for the area of concern. Enhancements at these locations will help bring us closer to supporting healthy fish and wildlife populations. It's important to note that while Cambridge Woods is not included in our current plan, it is mentioned within the recommendations because it's an important reference site for the Greater Milwaukee River Greenway. We consider this location a project model for potential restoration design. There are 3 phases to habitat restoration in the area of concern: assessment, planning, and management. For the enhancements to the Milwaukee River Greenway project, we are currently in the assessment phase. Typically in this phase, we are monitoring and surveying potential sites. We look at all the issues, as well as previous and existing habitat conditions. This type of work can include activities like field surveys of native and invasive plants, as shown in the picture from the Waukegan Harbor area of concern below. We are also looking at the species that utilize the habitat and their needs. Then we take all of this data and make recommendations based on those assessments. That's exactly what we are doing today. Once we move past the assessment phase, the recommendations that we make will be further refined into plan sets in the planning phase, and then eventually those plan sets will be used to implement habitat restoration work in the management phase. An important part of our assessment phase was to look at existing data and management plans that already have been created for the Milwaukee River Greenway. Some of these plans included the River District Riparian Land Management Plan from the Village of Shorewood, the Milwaukee River Greenway Habitat Plan put together by Gary Casper, and the Milwaukee River Greenway Master Plan. We also work with the River Revitalization Foundation and Urban Ecology Center to ensure that we had their existing and planned management activities for each of the sites, as well as the goals they had for restoring each of those locations. Then, as noted earlier, a major component of our assessment phase involved field surveys and monitoring throughout the Milwaukee River Greenway selected project areas. From fall of 2020 through fall of 2021, Milwaukee County Parks Natural Resources crews conducted inventories of native and invasive plants. They also took note of any species of concern, fish or wildlife, and made assessments of current conditions of the site, as well as any additional impairments. For the Milwaukee River Greenway, this involved assessments of canopy cover and issues related to the loss of trees due to emerald ash borer. 3 natural communities were identified within the Milwaukee River Greenway: Southern Mesic Forest, Floodplain Forest, and Southern Sedge Meadow. Recommendations were made based on our assessments for each of these community types. Each set of recommendations is designed to both meet area of concern goals as well as Milwaukee County Parks and partner goals for each of the project areas. Before we dive into those recommendations, here's a little background on those community types. Southern Mesic Forest is an upland forest community dominated by sugar maple, basswood, and beech trees. Mesic refers to the soil type. In this case, the rich, loamy, well-drained soil deposited here by the glaciers. Those dominant tree species form a dense canopy, creating a shady understory. One of the unique characteristics of southern mesic forests are the plant species that grow in that understory, which include shade-loving plants and spring ephemerals. Spring ephemerals are plant species that grow very quickly in early spring. They typically bloom, seed, and go dormant in the few weeks before leaves come out on the trees. A floodplain forest is a forest that's located along rivers and streams, typically in the floodplain. While dominant tree species can vary, common trees include silver maples, green ash, and swamp white oak. The types of plants that you would find in this area would be those that are adapted to periods of inundation by water. The southern sedge meadow is an open wetland community comprised mostly of sedges and water-loving flowering plant species. While this community type is undocumented for the Greenway, it is found elsewhere within the county and within Milwaukee County Parks. Southern Mesic Forest was found in Gordon, Hubbard, Kern, Pleasant Valley, Milwaukee River Parkway Section 5, and Riverside Park. The impacts to southern Mesic Forest found through our assessment were primarily invasive species and disturbance. Now, in our plans, we focus on invasive plant species, but in general, invasive species are non-native species that outcompete a native species for resources. In woodlands, garlic mustard are a common invasive species that can be found. As far as disturbance, we are talking about anything from historic human activity to current recreational activities like trail use, dog walking, etc. Both of these impacts lead to reduced diversity of native species and reduced natural community health. So then this leads us to our southern Mesic Forest management recommendations or actions. Our primary goal is to first remove invasive species and then revegetate with more native species. Through this process, we would target the use of species that are most beneficial to wildlife for revegetation. And then we're also looking at adapting for climate change. And that means we are selecting tree species that might come from the more southern end of our range as we are planning for the site moving forward. Floodplain forests were found throughout the Milwaukee River Greenway, but the sites with the most restoration potential were Kern, Pleasant Valley, and Lincoln Parks. The impacts to floodplain forests were very similar to the southern Mesic Forest. These included invasive species and disturbance, but also has to contend with the loss of trees due to emerald ash borer. As noted, a major component of floodplain forests tend to be ash trees. Our management recommendations are also very similar. We would first recommend invasive management and removal, followed by revegetation. However, there are some additional project goals. There is a potential wetland restoration in Lincoln Park. Currently, that site has been identified and needs some further study before we move forward. And then we also have to consider the difficulties associated with establishing native species in floodplains, which, as noted, can become inundated with water periodically. And then, of course, the pending sediment removal within the Greenway, which I will touch on shortly later in this presentation. As noted earlier, southern Sedge Meadow has not been documented in the Milwaukee River Greenway. However, there are several sites with potential for conversion to southern Sedge Meadow in Gordon Park, Lincoln Park, and the Milwaukee River Parkway Section 5. These are some of the most degraded sections of the Greenway and are dominated primarily by one invasive species, reed canary grass. Some of the concerns that we have to contend with are the potential difficulties in establishing vegetation in the floodplain, and again, as noted earlier, the future sediment remediation projects. However, our recent assessment shows that the Greenway contains 76 out of 155 potential southern sedge meadow species. This could give us a great opportunity to reintroduce a rare habitat back into the region. Our habitat management recommendations for southern sedge meadow are going to be very similar to southern Mesic Forest and floodplain forest, and that first we're going to recommend that we manage invasive species. Due to the degraded condition of these sites, this may take a little more time to successfully complete, but once that is done, we recommend planting with more aggressive native species. Once those are established, we would recommend then following with a second revegetation using higher quality plant species. Again, we would be targeting the use of species that are most beneficial to fish and wildlife. Continued management recommendations for this site also include prescribed fire. And finally, here's a brief overview of our project timeline. As you can see, back in 2019, the Milwaukee River Greenway was selected as a Tier 1 Area of Concern project. And then starting in fall of 2020, our habitat assessments, surveys, and partner coordination began. In spring through late summer of 2021, those habitat assessments as well as a wetland delineation were completed. And we are now in the August through November 2021 draft plan phase. We have a draft plan that has been sent out to stakeholders, and it's also available for review from the public. Once we have everyone's comments, all of the edits will be incorporated and a report will be finalized in December of this year. And before I go, I wanted to remind everyone of the other related area of concern projects on the Milwaukee River. We have 3 upcoming meetings that will provide more information on our Lincoln and Estabrook Park projects. That's on November 8th, Clutch Park on November 15th. And as noted, there is a sediment cleanup of the river coming, and that will be covered in the Milwaukee River Floodplains and Your Health meeting on December 13th. Thank you so much, and you can always contact me with further questions or if you'd like to have a copy of the management plan to review.